something that I feel personally is painful. And I want to share this with you because I want you to see a little bit of the process that we've been through. So when I went into the PhD, I really thought science is given. Everything that a professor tells me is true. If something is on a TED Talk or a YouTube video, I should take it for granted. If it's in a science paper, then for sure it has to be solid. If it has thousands of citations, for sure it has to be solid. But now I want to give you a sense of when this might not be true, what the things that you should be looking for, and then what should we make of this? What is it that we should think more about when we look at the literature? So for me, it's been a journey. I want to give you a little bit of that journey. But before I show you these very personal case studies, I want to tell you that this is my opinion. So it's not shared by everybody. So I think if you take Introduction to Social Psychology this semester, last semester, with people who are not me, then some of these studies are going to show up as this is credible evidence because this is in the textbook. So perhaps if you talk to some of the other people in HKU, they'll tell you a different story. So by the end of this session, you'll be able to make up your own mind. What is it that you think about? But my general feeling is that we should share these things with you so that you can make up your mind. You know what questions to ask and you know how to approach this literature. Okay? All right. So we have a few tools. I share those on the syllabus. We have tutorials on those, how to assess science credibility. These are work in progress. So these are Google Docs. They're collaborative. I open this up for everybody. And if you had a look at those before, then you'll see that it's not clear what's going on over there. So I share some of my thoughts. I invite people from Twitter, X, Blue Sky, and my teaching assistant and students to come and help me with this. But it's an initial thing. The only thing I can say about this is that I don't understand why this is not something that we've sorted out already. Why can't we just go to a professor and say, so how do we address science credibility? What factors should we look at? Why is this a subjective thing? Why do we have opinions on this? Surely we should have figured things out by now. So I just want to tell you, I'm working on it with a few other people. This is what we call meta science. We're getting some opinions. We're trying to get to a consensus, but it's work in progress. All right, so I'll start with a case study. And this one is an especially painful one for me, because when I went into my PhD, this was the #1 most important, greatest finding of social psychology. This is done by a few very prominent people, some of the most prolific people in social psychology, who I know personally. A lot of the things that happened during my PhD era was that if you did research in this domain, then for sure you will get a job. It's a very good investment for you to invest in this kind of literature. And this is called ego depletion. How many of you have heard of ego depletion before? None of you? Okay, it's a fairly simple idea, but before I tell you about this idea, I just want to tell you that there's a tool called Publish or Perish. Publish or Perish allows you to punch in some keywords and then see all of the literature. So sometimes when we do meta-analysis, when we want to search all the literature, we put this into Publish and Perish. You can download this. It's a free software. It connects to all the Web of Science, Google Scholar, and enables you to download all of the citations about something in a certain field. You can do this by a person. For example, if I want to see all of my studies or all the studies that cite me or everything that has to do with me, you just punch in my name. But here, for example, ego depletion, just a summary. This is from a couple of years ago when I did this. You can see that there's a lot of literature on ego depletion. So a lot of things are happening over here. Papers, 730, citations, 57,000, sites per year, 2,000 sites per year, sites per paper, 78, which is amazing, to have 80 citations per paper. This is unbelievable. H-index, 101. All these are just very, very impressive. How about the top one? The top one, as you can see over here, mostly with people like Roy Baumeister, and we'll talk a little bit about Roy. 6,000 citations, 3,480. Very, very impressive thing. So if we just look at some of the top ones from the Google Scholar of Roy Baumeister, who is the great thinker behind this, I would just say, Roy Baumeister is considered to be one of our greatest thinkers in social psychology. It's a great privilege to get to know somebody like this and to see how he thinks and to see how his lab works, all of that. And he has a lot of top papers. So in between, there's like stuff here on the top, and there's a lot of stuff here on the bottom. But when it comes to ego depletion, you can just see the top 4 papers, 8,000, 7,000, 5,500. So very, very, very impactful stuff. You can see the title. Ego depletion is the active self a limited resource. Is the active self a limited resource? What does this even mean? So the basic idea is that all of us, we're humans. So obviously we're animals. We come, our ancestors, like any other animals. But at some point in time, evolution has caused us to become social animals and to evolve beyond our urges, needs, and desires. So we all want to do all sorts of very basic things. But in order for us to collaborate, to coexist in society, we evolved from animals to social animals. In order to coexist with others in society, we developed the ability to listen, to look, to understand, to predict what others would want us. We develop norms. So there's a lot that goes on in the social context. In order for us to do this, we need a mechanism, and the mechanism is to override the self. So if we have an urge, need, or desire, so for example, right now you really need to go to the toilet, or you really are very hungry, or you didn't sleep and you need to go to sleep, you have the capacity to exert something called willpower, to say, although I have this urge, need, desire, I really need to eat something now, but I'm going to wait until the class is over. It's not you can keep eating, it's fine. But I'm going to wait until after class because now I have other goals in mind, or I have long-term goals. So instead of going right now and spending all my money on, I don't know, LV Gucci, then instead of this, I'm going to put the money in the bank and invest it. So later on, I will be able to get more education, be able to help my family, these kinds of things. So long-term goals and social goals, things that override our needs in order for us to think long-term and coexist with others in society. So this is what we call willpower. And the idea of ego depletion is willpower is limited. So if you exert willpower, the more you exert it, the less you have of it. So for example, something I think we can all relate to is that if we have a job or we go to the school and we interact with a lot of people that require willpower, we really want to get mad or we want to get upset or we're very tired of them, we exert willpower in order to overcome this and smile and be nice and be quiet and survive the day. And once we do this throughout the day, at the end of the day, we have no willpower left. So finally, we go home to the people that we love, to our friends and our families. And what happens then? Instead of just all of us being, loving circle, we snap, we get upset because we have no more willpower. So even the smallest thing can get us to explode. I feel like willpower to all of us felt like this is something that we can relate to. It's a very, very simple idea to understand. It's a very simple thing that we can see in our own lives and experiences. So ego depletion means that willpower is like a muscle. The more you use of it, the less that you have. Like you go to the gym, you get tired afterwards, and then you have no more willpower left. So in a different domain, you can't exert willpower anymore. Another thing about willpower, and the reason why people really loved it in social psychology and why this was considered to be a big message for the world, is that willpower, just like a muscle, can be trained. So like you go to the gym, if you go to the gym a lot and you train your muscle, the muscle becomes stronger. And over time, you can do more willpower. You can do more exercise, right? So if you teach kids how to exert willpower, if you're familiar with the marshmallow tests back then in the 1960s and 70s, but if you teach kids how to do well when it comes to willpower, to control themselves, then in the long term, they'll do better in relationships, in life, in studies, in finances, and so forth. Okay? Simple idea. Any questions about willpower? Seems very solid. Just look at all these citations, very prominent people involved in this. So not much to worry about. So when we want to know whether something is solid or not, what do? We do a meta-analysis, right? So meta-analysis is a very good tool because it looks at all the literature, and we saw just how many studies. We have thousands of articles saying willpower exists. Now we want to know just how much of an effect does willpower have, or ego depletion. So for example, if you get people to exert their willpower on one task, if they do another task, how much would this affect the other task? So the famous studies, the studies that I've seen when I was in that lab, is, for example, you have a task that requires some kind of willpower, but half an hour before that, you're asked to sit in a waiting room. And in the waiting room, you sit there, and there is a big chunk, a big bowl of cookies. And they make it just before you come into the waiting room, so the whole room is filled with the smell of cookies. You just feel, oh my gosh, I really, really want cookies. But next to the cookies, there's a sign that says, do not touch the cookie. So you're just sitting there waiting for your experiment, but basically the experiment has already started because you're resisting your urge to take a cookie. It's a little bit like the marshmallow studies that you might be familiar with from the 1960s. And then they go into the experiment, and they have a completely different task that requires willpower. So for example, circle all the certain letters in an article, very exhausting, requires a lot of attention. And then those who were exposed to the cookies in the waiting room, compared to the ones that were in the control that didn't have cookies, they did much worse on that task, right? That seems like a very basic clear experiment of you manipulate resisting the urge to eat a cookie. You're surrounded by these cookies. They're sitting next to you, and there's this letter that says you can't touch these cookies, and then you resist a bit, and then you're going to do much worse on resisting some other urge that will happen in the experiment. Okay, so this is kind of like the paradigm. So they did a meta-analysis on this. So how much of an effect is there? They can see over here. This is what it looks like. We have 198 studies. How many participants? Over 10,000 participants. So that's a lot of participants. And what is the Cohen's d? A Cohen's d is 0.62. I'll show you in a bit what 0.62 means, but take my word for it for now. That 0.62 is very close in social psychology to what we categorize as a strong effect. Okay? I will tell you how to think about this. But a strong effect, it means that this is a lot stronger than many of the other effects in social psychology. So when we see an effect like this, with 200 different experiments, with 10,000 participants, we think, oh my gosh, this is a very, very strong effect. Should be very easy to detect it in the lab. If I'm doing my thesis, I want to do my thesis on something like this, because this is reliable. This is strong. We see this consistently across many, many studies, hundreds of studies, hundreds of thousands of participants, and then overall, the effect is strong. So this is how we started out. We have this meta-analysis. You can see the person called Martin Hager with colleagues published this in Psychological Bulletin in 2010. 2010 is my second year of PhD. So I'm seeing this and I'm thinking to myself, oh my gosh, so social psychology really has a message for the world. Concentrate on willpower, train people for willpower. And then ego depletion is a real thing, and we need to know how to combat willpower and ego depletion, the reduction of willpower with a task like the one that are investigated here in this meta-analysis. Okay, so this is where I am in 2010. Issue starts when this paper comes out, and you can see very small here. This is 2014. 2014, some things happened between 2010 and 2014. If you recall our third session or fourth session about replication crisis, so we had BEM filling the future. We had Diederik Stapel, the Dean of Social Sciences, who committed fraud and had more than 60 papers retracted. So basically, after 2011, people were started asking, okay, if filling the future, published in a top social psychology journal, doesn't work, and now we know that there's a lot of fraud in things like priming, and the priming stuff doesn't replicate, how should we evaluate whether something works or doesn't work? And people said, oh, the way to do this is by looking at a meta-analysis. And we thought, but maybe there's an issue with a meta-analysis, because we did a meta-analysis of priming, we did a meta-analysis of a bunch of things, we saw an effect, but then we realized that there is no effect when we do replication. So what might be wrong? So 2014, suddenly there's a new method that comes out, and the method tries to say a meta-analysis covers the published literature, but it doesn't take into account something called a publication bias. So we talked very briefly about publication bias. The publication bias means that when you submit things that are not p-value lower than 0.05, you submit this to the journal says this is not interesting because you didn't find anything, reject it. So a lot of these things, people who didn't find an effect, all of it goes to the fall drawer. People just don't get this published. After a while, we learn this. So whenever we fail to find something, then we don't submit this to the journal. So what happens is that in the literature, what we have is only the things that are p-value lower than 0.05. So the example that I gave you last time was, let's say we have vaccination, and we want to know whether a vaccination works or not. And you have a pharmaceutical company, and they do a trial. They do 100 trials. Only 2 of the 100 trials work. If they submit all of the 100 trials to the journals look at the 98 and they say that's not interesting because p-value not lower than 0.05, reject, and only publish the 2 that worked. And then if you look at the literature, what do you see? Oh my gosh, I have 2 vaccination trials that work, which is terrific. I don't see anything else indicative of any failure. So therefore, let's just vaccinate everybody. But in order for us to really know whether something works or not, you need to see both the good, the things that worked, and the bad, the things that didn't work. Right? You need to see everything. This is publication bias. So these folks came out with a method taking the meta-analysis and doing a publication bias assessment. And when you assess the publication bias, you can do an adjustment. An adjustment means if we simulate studies that look like as if it's the way it's supposed to be, then we reassess the effect, and then we see whether the effect is as strong as before. So here you can see that they take exactly the same meta-analysis, the meta-analysis that was done in 2010. They say, okay, so it seems like it's robust, D of 0.62. But now we're going to look at the publication bias and see whether there is any indication of publication bias. And they see a lot of indication for publication bias. So if you look at this funnel plot, you will be able to see that there's some dots over there. There's these two triangles. We talked about this very, very briefly. I will come back to these dots in order to explain what this looks like. But for anybody who understands the meta-analysis, when we look at these dots, it looks very, very strange because this is not the way that we expect things to look. So this is what we see as indicative of a publication bias. So obviously there's publication bias. So for every one of the ego depletion papers, and we're talking about hundreds of those, for every one of those that worked, there's probably a lot that didn't work that never got published. What happens when you adjust for this? If you take this into account, you simulate these studies, even if you know nothing about them, what happens is, however, when we applied methods estimating and correcting for small study effects, such as publication bias, in the data from this previous meta-analysis effort, we found very strong signals of publication bias, along with an indication that ego depletion effect is actually no different than zero. No different than zero. How can it be? We have 200 studies in the meta-analysis, and we have a very strong effect. We have 10,000 participants. What do you mean? If we adjust this strange method that you're doing, and suddenly it's no different than zero? So a lot of people were very, very upset by this. And this came out. This was like a big shock to us. Not only were we shocked with Feeding the Future and BEM and then Vidrix-Stapel and all this, but when this stuff came out, it's like, this is blasphemy. Because ego depletion is the best thing that we have in social psychology. What do you mean? It could be zero. So more and more papers started to come out. 2015, this is the same authors, and now they're looking at different methods. So they're improving the methods again and again, and they're trying to get better at estimating how much of a publication bias there is, and then taking this into account. What do they find here? We find very little evidence that depletion effect is a real phenomenon, at least when it's assessed with the methods frequently used in the laboratory. And then you can do all kinds of adjustments. So it seems like when you take all these things into adjustment, then from 0.62, it drops to 0.2, 0.06, to all sorts of things that are much, much weaker. Not the big effect that we were expecting from the meta-analysis. And there's more and more of that. So an updated meta-analysis on the ego depletion. So not only this team, but other teams started to come out with all of these things with adjusted methods. So only in 2014 did we realize that actually when we look at the meta-analysis, we need to take into account, but we didn't know how to assess this. We didn't know how to correct for this. But first we realized we don't see the entire literature because people keep a lot of things in the file drawer. They don't submit this. Journals reject a lot of things. And then we need to apply some kind of method, but what method should we do? And different people start to come out with different methods for estimating and correcting for publication bias. So I showed you a little bit of this back in the third session. So we'll do this again. Before we did this for priming, now we're going to do this for ego depletion. I'm just going to open this again. Look at the P-checker, one for all. So once again, I urge you, if you're doing a thesis or you're doing an internship or you're doing something, especially if you go for a master's or a PhD afterwards, before you start to do anything, please feed all of the effects from the literature that you want to build on, put it here, and see whether this is solid or not. So before that, we went down here, and we did load demo data, and we did the elderly priming. But here you can see there's another one. This is glucose and self-control. So this is the ego depletion story. And the glucose thing was this theory by the same author that in order to replenish, so let's say you're running out of willpower. So you've done a class, willpower went down. You did another class, willpower, and then you went and you worked somewhere, then another willpower. By the end of the day, you run out of willpower. They were saying this is because you don't have enough glucose. So if you just go and buy a drink, energy drink with a lot of sugar, and you drink all of that, suddenly it replenishes. Right? So this was the idea of ego depletion being replenished by just getting some sugar into your bloodstream. So I'm just going to show you this literature. Somebody coded the whole thing, and you can see all the effects here. All the effects are detailed here. So the first thing that you can see is to check whether the p-values are correct or not correct, and then you can run a meta-analysis, and the meta-analysis is supposed to give you a funnel plot. And this funnel plot, I'll show you in a bit what this means, but there is a very clear indication that there is a problem here, there's a publication bias. Then we have all kinds of measures. So for example, Egger's test shows there's a publication bias, PET shows there's a publication bias, PEACE, publication bias. So all of these are different measures that we had in 2014 and 15 and 2018. People came up with different methods of estimating publication bias. And when we started putting this on these kinds of meta-analysis, then we saw, actually, we have a lot of indication for publication bias. In addition, there's something called a P-curve, which we talked about very briefly. So the P-curve means, so you can look here and see that the green one, I hope that you can see the colors. So the green one is what the p-values should look like, but the blue one is what the p-values really are. So when we look at the p-values here, yeah, so when we look at the p-values here, we can see that most of the p-values are just below 0.05. So instead of doing, going down from the most p-values below 0.001, and then less than 0.01, and then less than 0.02, instead what happens is that most of them, 32%, are just under 0.05. So this is an indication that there's both a problem with publication bias, and there's also an issue with perhaps some of the findings are being pushed by all sorts of practices in order to just go below 0.05. So when we look at this, if there's any evidential value, is it inadequate? There's some indication for that. And in addition, we can do all kinds of other different tests of insufficient variance, and we just see a lot of problems here. So one of the things that we can do is you can just put all these effects here and do this kind of analysis in order to get some kind of an indication of whether this is reliable or not reliable. So coming back to this funnel plot, I just want to show you what a real funnel plot. So if we take some kind of an effect, and the effect has a coherency of 0, if we just simulate random data, this is what it's going to look like. There's going to be like a triangle, and we're going to find most of the findings here. So everything is going to fall under this triangle of, on one side, we have standard error. So the smaller the sample is, the lower we get. Observed outcome is what is the coherency. So most of them are just going to fall under this triangle. And then a little bit, because of the randomness of the universe, there's going to be a little bit just outside that. But most of this falls here. If we discard the non-significant results, so we go from here, and we just discard all this because of publication bias, what we ended up with is just these things that are marked as black. So all these ones are disappearing. They're not there anymore. And this is what we're left with. So this already resembles a little bit the funnel plots that I showed you, both for the meta-analysis for ego depletion and the meta-analysis for the glucose and willpower. So this is a problem. It just goes to show that all of this, if it's all of this is empty, then it means that we have a problem. It doesn't look like what it's supposed to look like when we do a meta-analysis, right? So here's an example of money priming. So money priming is a little bit small, but I'm going to just read it out to you. We have a meta-analysis, a comprehensive meta-analysis of money priming. So when we do money priming, it looks a little bit messy, but at the end we have a G, a coherency, Hedges G, which is like a coherency of 0.35. This is like a medium effect in psychology. Now, this is what happens when we don't do any pre-registration, when we don't share all the null findings. But if we do a pre-registration, what happens? This is what happens. It looks exactly like it should. And most of it is under 0. The effect size is 0. And all of it is distributed under the triangle. So when we do things correctly with open science practices, when we do a pre-registration, then we move from this messy stuff to this very, very clean and organized, the way that it should be. Right? So this is what a literature should look like. Hopefully, if it's a good literature with a real effect, it's not under the 0, but it's under a different effect. Let's say, for example, 0.62. But this is not the case for a meta-analysis of ego depletion. It's not the case for meta-analysis of money priming. I'll just note very, very briefly, money priming was introduced to the world using a science paper, an article published in Science. So we used to think, okay, Science is very reputable. If it's published in Science, then everything is solid. This meta-analysis shows us that actually, even if it's published in Science, some of these findings don't replicate. Okay? So the p-curve, these are the people who came up with this p-curve. So a p-curve, usually needs to look something like the green one. So if we have a coherency of 0, if there is no effect whatsoever, then the distribution of p-values is 20, 20, 20, 20, 20. If we have a coherency that's a little bit above that, then we have a distribution like this, so 32%, then 21%, then 18%, 16%. If it goes even further, so for example, the meta-analysis by ego depletion should look like something like this. So 50% below 0.01, then 19, then 13, then 10, then 8. So this is very different from what we saw before. What we saw before is that most of the finding was just below 0.05. So now you have methods like the p-curve in order to see whether the pattern that you see for the p-values in this literature follows what is expected from real solid findings. Okay? So somebody actually went ahead and in 2016 said, okay, let's apply p-curve to ego depletion. And this is what they found. You can see over here, the expected one is the green one. And then what they found is the ones that are with the blue and the red. So their conclusion is effect sizes reported in this literature are possibly influenced by publication or reporting bias, and that even within study yielding significant results, the evidential value of this research is weak. This is really heartbreaking because we have more and more evidence, not just by one lab, but now a number of labs with different methods, some of them publication bias, some of them looking at the p-values, that if we analyze the same meta-analysis, the one that we thought was really solid from 2010, The one that when I saw in my PhD, I said, oh my gosh, this is what I should do my PhD on, right? So if we do all these kinds of analysis, actually, it shows that the effect is weak to non-existent. Very, very sad. So this is kind of like the summary of what I showed you so far. It's a little bit difficult to see some of this, but I'll just start from the right side. So the right side is the meta-analysis in 2010, and then more and more evidence throughout the time, getting us closer and closer to zero. So if we apply the piece publication bias, and if we apply the PET, and if we apply the trim and fill, and if we do a replication, and if we do all these things, we just get very close to zero. Now, already you can start to see in 2015 and 2016, I was already in my postdoc. These were difficult years, because if you remember 2015, we had the big science paper with the 100 replications where the effects that they found that were successfully replicated with was only a third, and then the magnitude was about half. So this was 2015. Now this comes out in 2016. Ego depletion, this is one of our biggest ones, right? So what to do? Now, let's say that you're in my position. You just finished your PhD, you're starting a postdoc, you're seeing all these effects. You thought ego depletion was a real thing. Now you're seeing all of that. What to do? How do we think about this? What would convince you whether ego depletion is a real thing or not a real thing? How to think about this? Should we trust the 200 papers? Should we trust the meta-analysis? Should we trust all these new methods about meta-analysis, publication bias, and paper? What to do? Very confusing, right? How would you solve this? What would you do? What would be a good way to address this? Replicate? Can you say a little bit more? What does it mean? You want to replicate, or somebody else needs to replicate? Who will replicate? How to replicate? What do you suggest? Okay, great. Already very good. Thank you for that. Anybody else want to build on this idea? What replicate? How to replicate? Any other things you want to suggest? We want to make sure that after we do this replication, we know for sure whether this works or doesn't work. How to increase your confidence. So let's build on it. Let's do a replication. What would you want from this replication in order to convince you whether this is real or not real? To be honest with you, in 2015-16, I also wasn't sure because we haven't done many replications aside from the science paper. We started doing cancer biology. It was only published like much, much later. But we didn't really know how to do replications well. So we gave it our best shot. We said, yeah, we're going to do a replication, but we want to make sure we do this well. So what do? So many studies, 200 studies. What should we do? We should select the most seminal, the biggest impact ones, the ones that we are most curious about, right? So we're going to select one that we can all agree is a good study of ego depletion that we can replicate, okay? Second criteria, we need big samples, right? We need a lot of people. And we don't just want to do this in one lab, in a single place. We want to do this in many places around the world. Third thing, we want to get people who understand ego depletion. Because we have so many people who are experts in ego depletion, we're going to get all of them to think together how to do this the best way. Fourth thing, we want to involve the people who did the original one, right? So we want to adhere to the strictest criteria in order for us to make sure that once the results are in, that nobody will ever question them. That there's no reason for them to doubt us. That we did whatever we could in order to find the effect. Okay? This is kind of like the idea that we had back then. I was not involved in this. I was just watching everything from afar. And I was thinking to myself, oh my gosh, I really don't know if this is going to work out. But I have to say, deep inside within me, I was 100% sure that this is going to replicate. It's going to replicate well. I wasn't expecting 0.62. I wasn't expecting something like that. I was thinking somewhere, and with a lot of people from around the world, somebody is going to show something for ego depletion because 10,000 participants, 200 studies, all these things in the meta-analysis. And I know these people, and I know that they do research well, and I appreciate them. And I just was certain because I've been brainwashed doing my PhD that this is going to happen. So this is what they did. They did a mass multi-lab pre-registered replication of the ego depletion effect. You can see a lot of people were involved. These are big experts. These are people who have done ego depletion many, many times and have published on ego depletion many, many times. So I was sure if they've published this before, that they should be able to produce an ego depletion effect. Everything was pre-registered and all the data was shared. At the end, with 23 labs, over 2,000 participants, conducted replications with one of the paradigms that they chose. What was the Cohen's d? The Cohen's d was 0.04. 0.04, not 0.62. What is a 0.04? A very, very, very weak effect. We don't just look at the Cohen's d, we also look at the confidence intervals, and we want to see whether the confidence intervals overlap with the null, with the zero. And you can see that because one is minus and one is positive, then it overlaps with the null. So basically, there is no support for ego depletion. 23 labs from around the world try to replicate this. Experts in ego depletion get together to try to find support for one of these things. So what did they find? These are the findings. You can see the distribution. So we talked about this very, very briefly, but I'm going to explain this to you again, just so you understand how to look at a forest plot. This is what's called a forest plot. Almost every meta-analysis has a forest plot. We're going to see one more of those later in the second case study. So in this forest plot, when you want to know whether something is reliable or not, you look at the top one. The top one is the target for replication, and the effect is 0.68. That's a very good, sizable effect, right? And then underneath, you have all the replications, different replications. And then you have this null effect. So this is zero effect. You can see that the confidence intervals of the top one does not overlap with the null. So it means p-value is lower than 0.05. If it overlaps with the null, then p-value is not lower than 0.05. It's higher than 0.05. So looking at all the results from all of the labs, all of them, aside from one, all of them, sorry, one, two, aside from two, all of them overlap with the null. Right? So you can see all the effects over here. And you can see the randomness. They go left, they go right, right? And then we want to know at the end, do we have an ego depletion effect or not? How do we do this? We apply a meta-analysis method. And then at the end, we have the diamond. And the diamond is what we care about. Diamond over here on the bottom. This is the meta-analytic effect. And then we look at the diamond, and we can see 0.04. And actually, the right side and the left side of the diamond is the confidence interval. And if the diamond overlaps with the null, it means that the meta-analysis concludes no support for ego depletion. Okay? So now you know how to look at the forest plot. You can see all the distribution all over the place. And it's nowhere near 0.68 that was in the original study. Okay? Any questions about this for the forest plot? When this came out, lots of newspapers started to write about this. So I collected a bunch of those. I took a slide from somebody who put all of these together. And you can see everything is crumbling, and people are using the same cookies I told you about that were in the waiting room in order to put like a photo of this. Another big psychology theory fails to replicate. Many scientific truths are in fact false. The end of ego depletion theory by neuroskeptic that we talked about. Replication project investigates self-control as a limited resource. Psychology's credibility crisis, the bad, the good, and the ugly. Obviously, not a good time to be a postdoc, because if you're looking at all of this and you're thinking one of the biggest findings in social psychology cannot replicate, this is very alarming for all of us. And then we had all the many labs that I told you about, many labs 4 and 5. Suddenly number 3 came out. Number 3, searching for the bottom of the ego well, failure to uncover ego depletion in many labs 3. So not only this mass replication by ego depletion experts on one target study, but another target study fails to replicate. And then we just like have more and more of these start to come out. So Garrison 2018, ego depletion reduces the evidence from too high. So some, for example, many labs 3 fail to find this, and then some of them say, but we can't find this. I'm going to show you even here at HKU. Some say, yeah, we can find ego depletion, no problem. I'm going to show you exactly how I think about this, how you can approach this. So just putting this into context, Hager over here with the meta-analysis is the same Hager who coordinated the mass replication effort. We have Hager here, Hager there. So Hager from the meta-analysis in 2010 saying 0.06, 0.062, to Hager in 2016 saying that the effect is 0.04. So the same Hager, the one who showed the effect is now the one who's taking down the effect. So going back to the evidence that you wanted in order to conclude whether this is solid or not solid. So now you have a mass replication effort. Now you know what the results are. What should you conclude? Is there an ego depletion effect or no ego depletion effect? I honestly didn't know what to think. Some of you did this with your hand. I'm not sure. Am I hallucinating? Is this a problem? Maybe the replicators don't know how to replicate. This is one of the things that convinced me in 2016 to put everything that I do aside and saying, I'm not doing anything until I figure out how to do replications and how to do pre-registration and how to do registered reports and how to do open science. Because I have to figure this thing out. Before I can figure this thing out, I'm not going to do any other research. Because this features prominently in every one of your social psychology books. You go to any bookstore, there's a lot of things about willpower and about ego depletion. So I'm going to just tell you the story of Michael Inslet. Michael Inslet is a person who I really appreciate. He's the advisor of one of our previous teaching assistants in this course, who is now going to become an assistant professor at University of Toronto next to Michael Inslet. That's very nice. Her name is Katie Tom. So she's doing very well, and she joined us to do a lot of replications in this class. So she's doing great over there. Michael Inslet is an interesting person. He was considered to be an ego depletion expert. And this is some of the stuff that he shared with us. Before I show you this, I just want to say ego depletion, so Neuroskeptic, was kind of arguing that this register replication report is the end of ego depletion. And now I'm going to turn to Michael Inslet. And I have to say that when I read these things, I had tears in my eyes because it's very difficult for me to see somebody like Michael Inslet, who has invested a lot of his career in ego depletion, write something like this in his blog. So I'm going to read this out to you. I have spent nearly a decade working on the concept of ego depletion. I have been rewarded for this work, and I'm convinced that the main reason why I get any invitations to speak is because of this work. The problem is that ego depletion might not even be a thing. By now, many people are aware, massive replication attempt of basic ego depletion effect involving more than 2,000 participants found nothing, nada, zip. How did this affect Michael Inslet? Very badly. So sometimes I wonder if I should be fixing myself more to drink. I am in a dark place. I feel like the ground is moving from underneath me, and I no longer know what is real and what is not. Somebody like Michael Inslet, one of the top people in our field, for a decade of publishing on ego depletion, says he doesn't know what to think about this. And when he's talking about drinking, he's not talking about Coke or cola. He's talking about alcohol, right? Funny because he has a podcast called Two Psychologists, Four Beers, where what they do is they drink 2 beers and then they talk about things. And I'm going to play to you some of this podcast. I really recommend this podcast. And this is where him and another person, Yoel Inbar, discuss some very personal things. I just want to say something about Yoel Inbar. So here are the both of them, Yoel Inbar and Michael Inslet. Diederik Stapel, the Dean of Social Sciences, that was found to be fraudulent in 2011 in Tilburg University. Who found out about this? It was a group effort, but it was Yoel Inbar, who was an assistant professor at Tilburg at the time. And he was looking at what Diederik Stapel was showing in his lab and said, this is too perfect. This cannot be. So he started talking to his PhD student. And after a while, they had enough to show that very, very likely that this is fraud. So both of them have some personal experiences. If you want to know more about Yoel Inbar and how he found out about the fraud, then there's a whole session. I teach this in some other time. We're not going to go into this. But I strongly recommend everything about this podcast. Two Psychologists, Four Beers. I'm going to play a session for you about how Michael Inslet feels in his own voice about what happened to him. 2016, mass replication effort coming out after he invested over a decade in this. How does this make him feel and think about the field?
But I don't think it's just that. I think it's realizing that a lot of the stuff that I worked on in the past, I just no longer believe in. I no longer, I won't talk about them anymore, right? There's a whole, the first part of my career on, stereotype threat and stigma. I moved on for a number of reasons, mostly just because I was, I'd lost interest and wanted to work on other things, and I'd got interested in other things. But I'm just not sure anymore. I'm just not sure about how solid that stuff is, and I want to talk about stuff that I'm sure about. I'm a scientist. And I understand as a scientist, one needs to embrace uncertainty. One needs to realize that we're dealing with many, many moving parts. We have to be humble, in the face of our data. But at least we should be able to talk with some confidence about some of the studies we've run. And I just no longer feel that way, at least about some of the stuff. I'm sorry.
It keeps on going. It's a whole session. Heartbreaking for me to hear this every time. And it gives you a sense of he's not just skeptical of ego depletion anymore. He's skeptical of everything that he's done before. But how can it be? He's a very highly regarded, reputable scientist. He's been doing this for decades. Now just because of this one replication effort, now suddenly he's doubting everything he did? What do you mean? But you did this. How are you skeptical of this? So very, very puzzling, right? Things that we need to consider. So I was also very skeptical of things in 2016, which is why I realized I needed to shift what it is that I do. I strongly urge you, if you're part of a lab, to sit down with your PI or whoever it is that you're doing research with and ask them, how do you react to something like this? What is it that you would take away from this? But if one of the most reputable persons in our field reacts this way publicly, sharing all this in a podcast, then you would want to rethink what it is that you do, right? Did people change the way that they do research? Did they align better? Did they change anything about the practices? How do they know whether something is solid or not solid, right? So this is just Michael Inslet. I urge you to go and listen to the rest of this. This is the main quote. I don't know what I would believe in social psychology if it was true, but there's no ego depletion effect. just let this sink in for you. Ego depletion was such a big thing that many people in our field said, we don't know what to believe. If ego depletion is not a real effect, then we don't know what to believe about social psychology anymore, right? So we asked him, so I just copy pasted a little bit of the interaction. I really appreciate it that they transcribed everything, so we have a discussion. I was not there. And this is what he says. So there's a lot here. I'm sorry all these people went through all this work of the replication. It's going to make it harder to get funding and this weird effect in the field. That's too bad. But in terms of changing my thinking or shaking my faith in ego depletion, no. He did not change his opinion on ego depletion. Why? Because he's been doing ego depletion for 20 years and he's been seeing this effect again and again. I know because I was there in the lab and I saw his students and his postdocs coming up with this effect again and again, showing ego depletion again and again. So especially if you're there, especially if you get all this evidence, like it can't be that this is not an effect, right? Yeah, but he thinks that we can agree on this, that this was an honest attempt, okay? So I'm just gonna share with you another summary from Michael Instead of what happened when Michael Instead met Roy Baumeister over there in Germany, and what was the discussion like. So just to recall again, Michael Instead believes that ego depletion is finished, and Roy Baumeister is not sure what's going on. Something is very odd about this, but very difficult for him to change his beliefs about this.
One quick story, and then maybe we can move on. So I was at a meeting last week in Munich, and we'll decide if we keep this in later, because maybe I'll be revealing things. I'm not sure.
Sorry,
so it was actually outside of Munich in the Alps. And it was a conference that was mostly younger people, so people who were kind of pro-reform, a new ways of doing things. And I only found out about this 2 weeks before we actually showed up. And my talk was prepared. I already knew what I was going to talk about. And would you know it, Roy Baumeister is there. He's there with, you've heard of compliment sandwich, I'm sure. Say one nice thing, then say the critical thing, then say a nice thing. The way the talks were set up was an insult sandwich. It was like criticism, Roy Baumeister, criticism. Anyway, so he was there. And
I want to say one thing about this. One reaction that happened from the community is that people were very, very upset by this, especially the open science people. So instead of being nice, calm, and community-oriented about this, it seems like some people piled up on this. And then they looked at ego depletion as if this is the biggest case study of how things can go wrong. So when you have an open science session like the one that Michael Instead joined, then they have a lot of things that they would sound like insults. This happens and this happens. And Roy Baumeister is one who represents ego depletion, was caught up in all of this.
I've got to say, even though I spar with him intellectually, and I think some of his ideas are incorrect, or many of his ideas are incorrect, I have to say I felt empathy for him. I think it was after this meeting that, he was saying things like, 25 years of my life have gone down the toilet. I've done nothing. What have I done? What have I contributed? What's the point of me?
I think it's really heartbreaking when somebody this impactful, who has published so much in social psychology, saying after this kind of meeting, 25 years of my life, what have I done? What have I contributed? Done a lot of research, contributed a lot. I don't know how this thing happened, but I feel like as a community, we really need to understand how could it be that ego depletion we had so much evidence for, now we don't have any more evidence for it. Right? This is heartbreaking for me because I know these people. Can you just imagine somebody who has all this kind of impact, has published so much, finally getting this kind of feedback from the community? Going into a conference where there's insult after insult saying, but your stuff doesn't replicate. I don't agree with you on anything. You fooled all of us. But it seems like this is not a Roy Baumeister problem. This is not an ego depletion problem. This is a problem that we have in a community. And we really need to sort this out. What is solid and what is not? What is credible and what is not? All right. So we were waiting for the official reply. So this was just one meeting, and it was not clear what's going to come out from this. So finally, came out an official reply. And the official reply was, in 2017, Kathleen Voss and Roy Baumeister, as the representative of ego depletion, 2016, issued this reply, misguided effort with elusive implication. They said, you chose the wrong ego depletion effect. We did not sign off on this. When you asked us, we said, yeah, go ahead, but we didn't really think about this. Actually, you chose the wrong target. But we know, Kathleen Voss and Roy Baumeister, we know that if we do this, we're going to find ego depletion for sure. There's no doubt in our mind. And what they did here is really nice because they took responsibility. They said, we're going to do this. So they wrote this, we will organize the pre-registered multi-site replication project next year using well-tested procedures ones that actually involve self-regulation. We're here with pre-registered hypothesis that depleted participants will perform worse. So I didn't know what to think about this. So what, we're going to do another mass replication effort? Seems like one is not enough, right? Met all the best practices that we talked about before, but now they're saying they did this wrong. So what's going to happen? 2016, we're really waiting for this. I really didn't know what to think about this, but in my heart, I was really hoping that this would come out and that it will show all of us that this is going to work out. All in big suspense. Look at all the people that were involved in this. So Kathleen Voss did an amazing job getting a lot of labs from many places in the world. Look at all these people, a lot of them I know. So they've conducted this with 36 different labs, more than 2,000 participants, so this time 3,500 participants. And this is what they found. Confirmatory tests found a non-significant result, 0.06. To remind you, the previous one was 0.04. Is this the 0.62? Is this the effect that we were hoping for, ego depletion done by the ego depletion people? All these labs from around the world? No, this is a big disappointment. However, they ran some exploratory analyses on the full sample, ignoring the exclusion criteria, so deviating from the pre-registration, and then they found a statistically significant effect, D equals 0.08. What to think about this? Now that you see this, what to conclude about ego depletion, works or doesn't work? It has a p-value lower than 0.05. Success. Is it success? Why is this not success? First, exploratory. This is not what they set out to do. This is not what they pre-registered. Second, statistically significant in a meta-analysis with 3,000 participants doesn't mean anything, because what we care about is the effect size. And the effect size here is 0.08 at best. So just to give you an idea of what 0.08 means, we'll do an analysis. I'm just going to show you that they did this. So now you know how to read this. You can see most of them overlap with the null. Going over this, the diamond is 0.06. Then they also do some Bayesian analysis. It goes all over the place. And this is HKU's contribution to that. So also was a TA in my lab, Bill, together with who is now our head of department, did this ego depletion replication. Another one, third one, mass replication effort. So multi-lab replication of the ego depletion effect. What do they conclude? Revealed small and significant ego depletion effect, D equals 0.10. Now, if you look at the distribution, all of them but one overlap with the null. Chen and Shi, this is from HKU. They are here, over here. But the conclusion here of this paper is that they found a small and significant ego depletion effect. D equals 0.10, which is very, very close to the one that we saw before, 0.08, 0.06, which is very close to the first one, 0.04. Now, I think this is a wrong conclusion, and you need to be very, very careful. And I think here that they did a mistake. I deviate from how they think about this. Their evidence, I accept it, but I don't accept their interpretation. So even when you read a paper by a head of the department or somebody that you know very, very well, who tells you, we found a small and significant effect, ego depletion exists, look at the evidence and what the evidence means. How many of them got the right effect, significant effect? One of them. When you aggregate all of them together, what do you get? D equals 0.10. Now, I want to give you an understanding of what D equals 0.10 is. So let's say, for example, you think, oh my gosh, this is an amazing effect. Ego depletion exists. I want to do my thesis on this. How many participants, if you do a power analysis, how many participants do you need to collect data for in your thesis in order to detect a 0.10? You want to guess? How many participants can we do in a thesis, undergraduate thesis? If we do 100 participants, we're like lucky, right? Very, very difficult, very time consuming, very demanding. Right? So we have something called, actually, both of them took this class for you. Now they're PhD students at Chinese U. They're about to graduate their PhD. Chinese U and University of Vienna. You can see over here Chin Yu and Xiu Kit. So Kit in short. They took this class, they did their MPhil with me, and then they started a lot of these things with me, including this one, Guide to Effect Sizes and Confidence Intervals. If you want, you can see a tutorial when Shinyu was actually a teaching assistant of this course. You can see the effect size tutorial here. How to think about effect sizes. So what is an effect size of Cohen's d 0.10? Here's what we have in our guide. So it's a collaborative guide. Any of you can go and contribute to it. If you contribute to it, you become a co-author. Some of the people here some of our best minds. So for example, you saw the publication Psychological Bulletin, which is the place where we publish meta-analysis. So the chief editor is, here's the co-author. The first author is the advisor for meta-analysis in Psychological Bulletin. So we collaborated with all of them, but it started here at HKU. This is our guide. They joined and they help us to make this very, very robust. So here you can see the guide to effect sizes. Small, medium, large. You can see originally Cohen's D, they said, a small effect is 0.20, but then we had a bunch of people in social psychology who said, actually, a small effect is 0.15, a medium effect is 0.38, and a large effect is 0.65. Social psychology, these are the effects. So what is an ego depletion effect? 0.10. Let's say that it's 0.10. What is it? It's smaller than small, right? So whenever you want to know, so what should I think about effects? Are they reasonable, not reasonable? What can I expect from this? You go to this, and you can see the empirical benchmarks. You can see all of these things in order to give you a sense of how strong is this. And then we didn't used to do this. Back in the day when I was doing my PhD, we did not do power analysis, but now we do power analysis. We do this a lot. And when you conduct a power analysis, this is using G-power, this is using R. You can see that if we conduct this meta-analysis, we can see that what you need is 2,476 participants in order to detect the effect of ego depletion. Even if there is an effect, and let's say that the folks at HKU are correct that 0.10 is a significant effect. But to study this is impossible. Nobody should study this. I would never advise you to waste taxpayers' money in order to pursue an effect that is 0.10. Because it's such a small, tiny effect, and you need a lot of participants to detect this, and the likelihood of you detecting this is very small. Okay? So you can see over here that just power of 80, if you increase the power to 95, then it goes higher. But you need 2,474 participants in order to detect this. Would you recommend to anybody to do this kind of business? So you shouldn't. So saying in a paper that we found a significant effect, either by exploratory in the second one or by the HKU one, that said 0.10, we found support for ego depletion. This is not support for ego depletion. Because if you aggregate all of these together, the effects are very, very small. And I would never advise anybody follow up on this literature. Any questions about the first case study? I will just summarize this. Biggest effect when I was in my PhD appears in every one of the social psychology books. Many, many publications, over 200, tens of thousands of participants, meta-analysis at the beginning that told us that this is one of our biggest effects. But what do we need? We need mass replication. Sometimes we need more than one mass replication in order to convince some people. But a lot of people, including the ones that conducted these research, these studies, these experiments, have conducted those for decades. Even they think about drinking themselves with alcohol, changing the profession, rethinking what it is that they do. Because mass replication efforts, registered reports, pre-registered with a lot of studies are the ones that give us something that's closer to the true effect. So a lot of things to take from this case study. What you need to take for your project one is to look at the most updated things. Just having hundreds of articles, just having a lot of participants, just having a meta-analysis from 2 decades ago, saying, a decade and a half ago, saying that there is an effect is not enough. You need to see best practices of open science. You need to see replications again and again. You need to see pre-registrations. You need to see open data. So I urge you, when you see something, before you invest your time in your thesis, in your internship, before you go into project one and say, but this appeared in a science paper, therefore it's solid. This was in a TED talk, therefore it's solid. I urge you, take a moment to think and do research in order to see whether there's solid, independent, high power, pre-registered, open science practices replication. Okay? All right, let's take a 5-minute break, come back, and I'll show you the second case study. Case study number 2. This one is not on the same magnitude as ego depletion, but I'm using this case study because there's other ways I want you to think about in how to assess whether something is credible or not credible. So we'll try and do a little bit of this together in order to get you thinking when you read an article, how to assess an article that you read, whether this is solid or not solid. So there's some readings that if you want, you can look into. So for example, I can already tell you there was a mass replication effort of this. This is the target article. This is the multi-lab registered replication report. And this is the paper that I want us to think about. So first looking at this paper, published in 2011, it's published in Psychological Science. Psychological Science is one of the highest impact factor journals for empirical studies in psychology, not just social psychology, but also in other types of psychology. So getting a paper in Psychological Science is a big thing. I only have one of those. But really, it's an accomplishment because it means that you've met very high standards. Rejection rates are very, very high, like 90-something%. You can see over here that we have learning about what others were doing, verb aspect and attribution of mundane and criminal intent of past action. Already there's like a lot of interesting things over here, so it seems like it's applicable to all sorts of different things, but at the core of it is something called a verb aspect. So let's see what this paper is about. We tested whether the attribution of intentionality, whether you think something is intentional or not intentional, what is it influenced by? Whether the person's behaviors are described, the description of the behavior is what the person was doing or what the person did. That's the only difference. So if you attribute intentionality, depends on the way that things were described. In 3 experiments, participants who read what a person was doing showed enhanced accessibility of intention-related concepts and attributed more intentionality to a person. So if you read the person was doing something, then you think that it was more intentional. Okay? This is the main. If true, this is very important for us to know, because when we describe things, we need to be very careful of whether it's people can assume intent or not, especially when we describe this, let's say, in the courts, or when we make an assessment of something, whether it was intentional or not intentional. Now, I took the liberty of putting the methods for you. So I want us to go through the methods together and think about each and every section here, okay? So we'll start from study 1. Study 1 sample. To test our hypothesis, we asked 54 introductory psychology students to read a series of 15 descriptions. So already, you can think about whether 54 participants is enough for this kind of study. I can tell you that Psychological Science 2011, 54 was pretty normal. A lot of studies were conducted on 20 per condition, 30 per condition. So here we have more than 20 per condition. We have 54 participants. Okay? So you can think whether this seems like it's solid evidence for you or not. Manipulation. So imperfective aspect, Keith was preparing for dinner for some friends. Keith was reading or read a chapter in his psychology book. Keith made or was making a small talk with the neighbors. So now you have a sense of what the manipulation is. They read a scenario, and the scenario either had was doing something or the verb. So reading, read or was reading, prepared or was preparing, made or was making. This is the manipulation. Everything else about the scenario is exactly the same. The only thing that changes is the verb. Right? Is this a strong manipulation or is this a weak manipulation? What kind of an effect would you expect when you manipulate this kind of thing? Right? So think about this manipulation. Dependent measure. Word related to intentions, try, aim, goal, determination, plan, intent, and want. Or a word not related to intentions, toy, ale, code, determination, peon, intent, and so forth. How did they study whether people answered this or that? They gave them word puzzles. So S, underline, P, T, underline Y. And they thought if people attribute more intention to it, then they'll use intention words. So what is intention words? When you have the T underline Y, then it's toy rather than try. Or AI underscore ale and aim. So is this a very direct kind of measure? Or is it very indirect kind of measure? Does this say something about intention, not say something about intention? But I can say Psychological Science 2011, actually in cognition, especially social cognition, especially social priming, these are very standard DVs. What would you expect from these kinds of DVs? So people chose this letter or that letter. Okay? They expect big effects or small effects. So we have a very indirect slight manipulation, and we have a very strange indirect implicit kind of measure for the DV of whether this was intent or not intent. Okay? So we have a very small sample, very standard at the time. We have very, very indirect kind of a manipulation, very slight, something was doing or did, right? And then we have a very implicit kind of measure. Put all of these together, what kind of an effect would you expect? So looking at the results section, let's look at the results section. As predicted, Participants in the imperfective aspect condition completed more word stems in the word denoting intentions than participants in the perfective aspect. What is the coherence B? So first of all, p-value 0.001. A lot of people would say, oh, 0.001, you just said in a p-curve, just below 0.05, at 0.001, that means amazing evidence, right? No, because what do we need to look at? We also need to look at the coherence D. Coherence D of 1. Now, I showed you the benchmarks from before. We consider the strong effect to be 0.65, right? Strong effect. Strong effect is something that you can see the impact. You can feel it very, very noticeable. And then you can expect this kind of thing. Usually, it involves a very strong manipulation and very specific, well-measured PVs. Is this the case here? No. We have small samples. We have very slight manipulations, and we have something very implicit to measure. And then suddenly we have a coherence D of 1. Very, very strong effect. This is very surprising. So when you see that a paper, even if published in Psychological Science, even if the p-value is 0.001, you want to ask yourself, does this make sense? Is this what I would expect here? And this is not what I would expect from this kind of manipulation with these kinds of measures with that kind of sample. Okay? Once again, we'll go back to the effect size guide that we have from people who graduated from this class. We look at the benchmark. We can see that the effect size, large effect size is 0.65. So this is a very large effect. Okay? So now you see this paper, and it's published in a good journal, and it has this study number 1, and it has these issues in it. Do you expect this to replicate well or not? We didn't know, because back then the standards were that. So here you can see just a summary by the authors. So the authors were asked by the Association for Psychological Science, the APA, no, APS, Association for Psychological Science, to summarize their findings. So I just want to show you what is it that the media, the HKU, or every university media calls us and says, can you please summarize your research for us? So for example, here they said, this reveals that the way the statement is phrased and specifically how verbs are used affects our memory of an event being described and may also influence our behavior. May also influence our behavior. Do they have anything related to behavior? Not so much. So yeah, we have more of this. And this I especially like. The authors note that these findings may be relevant to behavioral therapy. Now you can use this in your therapy. They suggest that decreasing the frequency of unhealthy behaviors might be facilitated by discussing these behaviors in terms of what I did. In contrast, increasing the frequency of healthy behaviors might be facilitated by discussing these behaviors in terms of what I was doing. Does the evidence warrant this kind of conclusion and suggestion? But I think we need a lot more caution, humility. At the best, we can say that this is suggestive. We need follow-up. We need more replications. We need some meta-analysis. We need a bunch of other things, including open data. I'll show you why this is important in order to make sure that this is solid. Before we go and we tell the world that they should put this in behavioral therapy. Be careful how you speak in behavioral therapy because it's going to influence the intentionality of the people. Okay? Be very, very careful. So now you can see Alex over here, who's one of the biggest guys, at least in my view, of open science, has done amazing things for open science. He became an editor in this journal of Perspective of Psychological Science, one of the most reputable ones. And he wrote about, we're going to run a replication of this study. This is what he wrote about this replication. Prior to data collection, each of the 12 participating labs predicted that the effect that they would observed, 8 expected the effect to be at least D, coherence D of 0.55. So even experts in the field, when they saw exactly the same evidence that you saw right now, they said, yes, we feel that this is going to replicate. Not only replicate, but even a strong effect, 0.55. This is a very reasonable kind of thing to expect from something published in Psychological Science. So the individual results and the result of the plan analysis surprised all 12 of the team. The people saw the results of the replication effort, and it surprised all of them. We're not just talking ego depletion, but also with other things. There's no caution or humility. We really thought everything published in Psychological Science is going to come up. You already know how to read this meta-analysis forest plot. So you can see that the main effect here is even higher. It's 1.20. Then you can see all the replications. If there's anything significant, it goes in the other direction. But generally, what do we look at? We look at the diamond, and the diamond overlaps with the null. And finally, we don't have any support for that from our meta-analysis, right? So he said, why did we do this replication effort? Because there was 2 studies that I saw that found an effect and 2 others that did not produce a significant effect. So we feel like we need to do a replication study. We run this replication study. We find no support for this effect. So another one of the many failed replication attempts that we've done. I showed you ego depletion. Many weeks ago, I showed you a lot of priming. Priming failed. And I'm showing you this, failed. And then we look at the different DVs. So there's more DVs here. So there's another DV, this failed. There's another DV here, it failed, failed, failed again and again. What to make of this? Why do you need another case study? I can give you 20 other case studies. Why is this one important? First, I want to show you that you can look at a method section of an article and have a basic understanding of whether this is reliable, whether this makes sense or not. You look at the samples, you look at the methods, whether the methods are implicit or explicit, the measures are good or not good, and then you see whether this aligns with the evidence, for example, the result section. A coherence D of 1 or 1.2 is too large. It's too large for a lot stronger stuff. Even with ego depletion, we thought, 0.62, very strong. 1, that's way too much. If you remember from the priming, we saw a coherence D of what? 6.5 or 5.6. Impossible effect. So for these kinds of measures, with these kinds of manipulations, with this kind of small sample, coherence D of 1 does not make sense. Okay? So why this case study? Why do I decide to bring you this case study? Aside from the fact that I, was keeping track of this because these are people that I know. So this is already something. So just look at this. You can already see it has a notice of retracted, and you can see this sign of retracted on it. They reached out to the original author and said to them, we ran this mass replication effort, and we can't find any support for this effect. What's your reply? They said, what do you mean? We already replicated this. We've done this replication. It's replication from 2013. And this is the study that done the replication. Now, when they did this replication, it didn't have retracted on it. It was just there. Also, in a good journal, Psychological Science, 2 studies, one in 2011, one in 2013, by the same author. So this is William Hart, showing support for this effect. Right? So he said, I don't know what your labs are doing when they're doing these replications. I already know that this works because I replicated this myself. So sometimes you'll hear people saying, oh, these cell replications, we don't care about those because I saw this effect again and again. I was able to replicate it. Now, the nice thing about this is that when he claimed that the mass replication effort is not worth anything because he replicated this again, we asked him, can you please show us the data? And he did. He shared the data with us. And this is what happened. So the open science folks are very, very happy with this. It's a little bit small, so I'm going to read this out to you. So the dean of, I think, Erasmus in the Netherlands said, I really wanted to see this effect because I just completed this mass replication effort and found nothing. So I want to see something that worked, that replicated this. So here's what he did. This is very, very small. But he just opened the data set. And there's a description on the right where people were asked to write stuff. So he just sorted this out so that all of this showed up together. And immediately he saw, so each row is a different participant. But then what did he see? That some rows have duplicates. So these two, these two, these two, these two, right? So all of these have the same participant. But not all the rows are duplicated. Just some of the rows are duplicated. And the rows that are duplicated just help the effect go in a certain direction, the direction that helps this find support for the effect. What do you think about this? Now, why do we need to wait till there's a mass replication effort in order to get the data? Why don't we share the data to begin with so that anybody can go and assess this? Anybody can open this. Because this is so stupid that anybody can find this if they just open up the data. Immediately you can see there's lots of participants who are duplicated. And this is duplicated not for everybody. So this is not an honest mistake. This is duplicated in a very specific way in order to cause an effect to be there. So here he describes this. Immediately I discovered some discrepancies between what was reported in the commentary and what was in the data file, both in the condition mean and the p-values. What could explain these? I sorted the file by verbal responses. Lots of duplications started popping up. Here's the sample. So all in all, there were 73 duplicates in the set of 194 subjects. This seems quite alarming. After all, the experiment is the one that shows support for blah, blah, blah. So very alarming. What to do about this? What to think about this? Very sad. This is a fraud case. Now the question is, we found indications for fraud. Lots of questions to ask about this. First of all, why don't we have open data for everything so that anybody can look into this? But okay, let's say back then in psychological science, no standards for sharing data. Nowadays, it's mandatory. So psychological science editor, she's very serious about open science. We're very grateful that she's now the editor. Has very high standards for open science. Nowadays in psychological science, this would not flow. Another thing that they have in psychological science that they did not have back then, they have a reproducibility red team. They have independent people going over the code and over the data in order to make sure that this doesn't happen. But Psychological Science is the only journal that does this. Many other journals don't have this because they don't have open science editors like Samin was there in Psychological Science. So we're very grateful that at least Psychological Science has learned from this and is now implementing something else and has hired an editor that cares about open science. Second thing that you want to ask about this is, okay, there was fraud here. Who is to blame? What to do about it? Now, there was one person who is on this paper. In the previous one, there are two persons on this paper. So who gets blamed? Who to blame in this situation? You. They blame you, students. So who did the fraud? Not William. So study examining was retracted. By whom is the question? The notice cites an unnamed graduate student. Unnamed graduate student. So whenever I give a course to students, regardless of where they are, also when they work with me, I urge you to document everything that you're doing, just in case something happens afterwards that you're not the ones to be blamed for it. I have a bunch of questions, a lot of questions I have about this paper. What just happened here? So let's say that the student did this. Let's say that you did. Why are you not a co-author on the paper? Where is the name and the attribution for this? Can't be that you get none of the credit, but you get all the blame and the responsibility for this. This just seems a little bit ridiculous. Finally, if you're not credited for this, an unnamed, unknown, anonymous, so notice cites an unnamed graduate student as a source of the manipulation, and it says that the only author, William Hart, was unaware of what had occurred. A question that you want to ask, what is the responsibility of the one person who is the author on this paper? So let's say that I did work with a student, and the student did give me some data. What's my responsibility? Do I just accept it? Should I run some checks? Should I be involved in this kind of thing? What is the relationship between a student, what you're doing, and your advisor? Right. So I ask a lot of questions here. I don't have good answers, but it's things for you to think about. So there's lots of things in this case study for us to take away, not just about how do we assess credibility of studies, but also how we work with others, how we document things. Now, if we had open science, if we had a lot of people involved, if everybody got credit, if everything had open data and code, then all of this would be a lot clearer. Then we knew who is responsible for what stage, where things got wrong. We would have caught this a long time ago. We didn't have to wait to 2016 for the mass replication effort. We don't need the dean from Erasmus University in order to open some data file by some study. We don't need, like, none of these things in this paper make sense to me. But I urge you, go and ask other professors, ask your lab, ask your PI, what happens nowadays in the way that we do science? Most of our science is closed. Most of the students are not credited for their work. Most of the data and code are not shared. Most of the research does not have replication, definitely not by independent labs. How much fraud do we have in the literature? Who knows? We don't know. We only knew this after we ran replications, but from 2011, 2013 until 2016, could have run for a very long time. How many people have implemented this in behavioral therapy? Who knows? No? We can talk about this in TED Talks. We can put this in books. We can teach this to our students. But until we're able to verify things, until we open up everything, we don't know what is credible or not. So in your first project, it's really not about whether this was published in Science or Psychological Science. It's not whether about the number of articles. It's not about the number of participants. It's not even about a meta-analysis that shows an effect. It's not about how famous the person is. It's not whether there's a replication from the same lab that showed an effect. Because if you haven't verified, if you haven't seen this from many independent labs, it wasn't pre-registered, if there's no open data in code, then this doesn't mean a lot. So it's much better to be cautious and humble and say, we don't really know yet if this is solid or not. So before we go and do a TED Talk, before we have a New York Times bestseller book, let's take a moment in order to verify this. We don't jump into conclusions. Only after we have an accumulation of evidence, leading up to the highest standards of open science and transparency, only then can we come to the audiences and say, this is what we think works. So we need a lot of humility. So when you do your project one, really think very, very carefully. Do not be blinded by where the person is from, where it was published, how many replications they did themselves, if this was published in Science or not. There's other things to take into consideration. So hopefully these two case studies will give you a little bit of a taste of the things that you should be looking at. And some of these things you can see by your bare hands, your naked eyes. You can see these in the articles when you open them up, when you look at the method section, because some of these things just don't make sense. So after the replications fail and after we see the fraud, I have hindsight bias. So it's very easy for me to say, yeah, of course, we knew this all along, because you can't find these kind of large effects with these very implicit, very indirect measures and manipulations. But back in 2016, I was sure everything in psychological science works. Everything is solid. Ego depletion is one of our strongest findings. Very disappointing. So now I don't know. Just like Michael Inklid said, I don't know what is real and what is not. Just like Roy Baumeister, I tell myself, 25 years of my life, in my case, 15 years of my life. What have I done? What is reliable? What is not reliable? What should I teach students? What should I teach students? So I hope this gives you enough of a feeling that you need to discuss these things with your professors, with your labs, with your PIs. If you decide to go for a master's, something that you think about in order for you to do more credible science. If you're doing a thesis or an internship, please take these things into consideration and think about those. Yeah, my main message for you, you do research, doesn't matter if you do this in academia or industry, open up everything, validate everything as early as possible, welcome and incentivize community to help, embrace and share mistakes. I'll finish, hopefully, by today, tomorrow, the data collection for project 2. I'll share this with you. If I see even more delays, then I'll share an update on Zulip. Hopefully, I'll have something for you so you can keep working on this. If you have any questions about today or what's to come with project 2, then feel free to contact me on Zulip. I'll see you next week.